Today we're going to briefly go over one simple machine, the wheel and the axle. The wheel and the axle, categorized as a simple machine, and we want to talk about mechanical advantage of the wheel and axle. Essentially, with a wheel and an axle, most people tend to think of automobile tire, because that's usually what we talk about is a wheel and an axle. Two wheels attached by an axle. But what we want to think about to help illustrate the point of the mechanical advantage of the wheel and axle is something more along the lines of a steering wheel. Essentially, the steering is done by the central column. But if you had to grip that central column and turn it with your hand this way, it would be almost impossible. So by attaching a wheel to that central axle and moving the radius of that circle out, it takes much less force to turn the central axle and therefore to turn the car. So what you have then is a mixture of one type of force, the wheel, attached to the axle, making it easier then to do what you would ordinarily have to exert a great deal of force if you grabbed the main axle itself and tried to turn it by itself. So I've got a picture here. This is the central axle here. This is the outer wheel of the steering wheel, if you will. If we had to grab the central column and turn it, it would be almost impossible for us to get enough force. But you move the wheel out, attach to the axle, and you apply force out here, and it becomes much easier to turn here. So force here translates here to greater force. So the mechanical advantage increases with the radius. So I've got an example up here. If we've got a radius of 12 versus a radius of 10, with our axiom over here, the mechanical advantage increases with the radius. Bigger radius, 12, means greater mechanical advantage. What we mean by that is if the same amount of force was applied to the outer wheel at 10 inches and the same amount of force applied to the wheel at 12 inches, you would get a much greater advantage at the 12-inch radius than at the 10, assuming the same amount of force is applied. It becomes, it translates here to the central axle much greater. So the mechanical advantage is greater the larger the wheel is. And in the same way, if you've got a larger wheel, it takes less force to turn it. So if you think about it, sometimes in little sporty cars, they have sort of smaller steering wheels, but when you get to something as big as a bus or an 18-wheeler, they usually have very large steering wheels. And this is just an application of this simple machine, the wheel and the axle, the mechanical advantage increasing as the radius also increases. Well, this has just been a basic overview then of the simple machine, wheel and axle. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video, you'll find a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to that website that has that information. And while you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a process used by plants and other autotrophic organisms to convert light energy, usually from the sun, into chemical energy that can be used by the organism. Photosynthesis usually gives off oxygen as a waste product as well. Oxygen is not something that the plant or other autotrophic organism will need in most cases, and so it will give off oxygen as a waste product. Now, autotrophic means that these organisms make their own food. They are capable of creating their own food. They can harness the light energy and create their own source of nourishment. Heterotrophs cannot do that and must rely on autotrophs or other heterotrophs for their nourishment. Most plants, most algae, and cyanobacteria perform photosynthesis and are called photoautotrophs. So, autotrophs are organisms that can create their own food. Photoautotrophs are organisms that create their own food from light, since photo translates to light, looking at the Latin root for that word. These are organisms that can create their own nourishment from light. Photosynthesis maintains atmospheric oxygen levels and supplies most of the energy necessary for life on Earth. So, as these autotrophic organisms take in carbon dioxide, they let out oxygen and help maintain the atmospheric oxygen levels, because people and other organisms exhale carbon dioxide, and the plants or other autotrophs take that carbon dioxide in and turn it back into oxygen, which we breathe. So if we didn't have photosynthesis, we'd be running low on oxygen. And so photosynthesis helps maintain our oxygen levels. It also supplies most of the energy necessary for life on Earth. Even though you don't feel like you're eating light or getting your energy just from light, if you eat a vegetable, then you're eating something that it has only been able to grow because it used light energy to provide nourishment for itself. So you are now eating that plant, which got its energy and was able to grow from light. If you were to eat a cow, if you had beef, if you had a hamburger, then you would be eating another heterotroph. Cows can't make their own food, but they ate grass and other vegetables and other foods that were grown, and they were grown by having light energy harnessed inside those plants. And so the cow got the energy from the plant, which got the energy from the light, and then you were getting energy from the cow. So it all comes back to the light energy. So while there are other sources of energy, the light energy is a primary source for everything going on Earth. Photosynthesis always begins when energy from light is absorbed by proteins that contain green chlorophyll pigments. So the autotrophs that perform photosynthesis don't always look green, but somewhere in their body, they're going to have these chlorophyll pigments that are able to take in and absorb light to start the process of photosynthesis. And photosynthesis occurs in two stages. You have your light reactions or light-dependent reactions, so these depend on light to happen. And it's when organisms capture and store the light energy. The light energy is converted to chemical energy in the form of NADPH and ATP. So in this light reaction or light-dependent reaction stage, the light energy is actually captured, turned into a chemical form of energy that can be stored or immediately used if necessary. In the carbon dioxide fixing reactions or light-independent reactions, these are ones that can happen even whenever light isn't present, as long as there was some energy harnessed in that plant already. So these don't have to happen while there is light present supplying energy. They can happen later. And this is when the formed NADPH and ATP, so it's already stored and formed in that autotroph, those two energy molecules drive the reduction of carbon dioxide to more useful organic compounds, such as glucose. And they are also referred to as the Calvin or Calvin-Benson cycle. So when the carbon dioxide is reduced, that process can be called the Calvin or Calvin-Benson cycle as well. So even though this is a light-independent reaction, it does still depend on molecules that were created by converting light energy into a stored chemical energy. So even though we call them light independent, they really couldn't occur if you didn't have the light transferring, the light energy that was able to be transferred to these energy molecules that are stored chemically. The main thing to remember about photosynthesis is that it is the process by which autotrophs can make their own energy using light.
Light is the portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that is visible because of its ability to stimulate the retina. Light is absorbed and emitted by electrons, atoms, and molecules that move from one energy level to another. So an atom might release energy to move to a lower energy level, but absorb energy to move to a higher energy level. Now, visible light is between ultraviolet and infrared light on the spectrum. So it's anywhere from 380 nanometers all the way up to 760 nanometers. So 380 would correspond to the color violet, and 760 would correspond to the color red. This is because the human brain interprets or perceives visible light as color. For example, when the entire wavelength reaches the retina, the brain perceives the color white. Now, when no part of the wavelength reaches the retina, the brain perceives the color black. Atoms and molecules can gain or lose energy only in particular discrete amounts. Therefore, they can absorb and emit light only at wavelengths that correspond to these amounts. So, using a process known as spectroscopy, these characteristic wavelengths can be used to identify substances.
Genes. A gene is a molecular unit of heredity of a living organism. A gene is the basic instruction, a sequence of nucleic acids. So a gene is going to be the instruction, it's going to be the sequence of nucleic acids that tells the cell to code for a certain protein or for a certain RNA chain. It isn't just one little thing, it's a sequence that gives an instruction to the cell. While an allele codes for one variant of that gene. So if you've heard someone say, oh, she has really good hair genes, or she's got the gene for blue eyes, that's not exactly true, because everyone has a gene for eye color or hair color, and for every other trait that you have. But what determines what color your hair is or what color your eyes are is going to be the alleles for that gene. So there are dominant alleles and recessive alleles. And if you have even one dominant allele, then you're going to have the dominant gene. If you have two recessive alleles, then you will have that recessive gene. For instance, if you have two parents that have brown eyes, you could still end up with blue eyes because blue is a recessive gene. So both of your parents had one dominant and one recessive brown and blue eye color allele. The brown would have been prevalent in both of them. But since they both had that recessive blue allele present, you could still end up with blue eyes because of the recessive alleles combining. And I know that all sounds a little confusing, but it's just to tell you that each gene doesn't determine something all on its own. It's the alleles that are the variants of that gene that determine what the outcome of each gene sequence is. Genes do specify all proteins and functional chains. So they specify how these are going to be created, the functional RNA chains. Genes hold the information needed to build and maintain an organism's cells and pass genetic traits to offspring. So where I was talking about two parents that could have brown eyes and still pass on the blue eye color, it's because of the alleles that they carry, whether dominant or recessive, whether you can see it as a physical trait or not. Your parents carried genetic traits and they passed those on to you. And some of your physical traits may not all be the same as one or both of your parents, but the genetic traits that you got did come from the alleles that they had combined and mixed together. So you took some of your mother's alleles and some of your father's alleles, and when those combined, you ended up with different alleles and different genetic traits of your own, but they both came from the genetic traits your parents had. Some examples are eye color, number of limbs, and blood type. So some genes you can see right away manifested, such as eye color or number of limbs. But blood type is something that you would have to do a little more scientific research to discover. You can also search for certain markers in your body for diseases such as Alzheimer's or other hereditary diseases, those can be tested for, and your DNA will show, your genes will show if you have a likelihood of getting that disease. And so that's definitely not something you can see just by looking at someone. It's something that you would have to do more research into. But it's possible by looking at the genes in your body. Now, for a gene to create or code for its protein, it must go through transcription. And transcription is where single-stranded messenger RNA or mRNA is created that is complementary to the DNA from which it was transcribed. And we'll look at that over here in just a minute. But basically, you're starting with DNA and you're transcribing it into the messenger RNA. And then the messenger RNA is going to bring the message elsewhere in the cell. So next comes translation. That messenger RNA is used as a template for synthesizing a new protein. Transfer RNA, or tRNA, brings the amino acids and anticodon necessary for protein synthesis. And something to remember is that genes are read 3 nucleotides at a time in units called codons. So you look at the 3 nucleotides that are coding for this one protein, and they're going to be transcribed onto messenger RNA, which is going to travel elsewhere in the cell, and transfer RNA is going to bring the amino acids and the anticodon that match up with that set of 3, with that codon, and let the protein be created. So let's look at that over here. Let's pretend this gene sequence came from a strand of DNA. And remember, your bases are adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. So we are going to say it's going to change from DNA to the messenger RNA. So we're transcribing here, and each base must be transcribed. So here we've got our transcription. So the guanine is going to transcribe to cytosine, cytosine to guanine, thymine to adenine, cytosine to guanine. There we go. Thymine to adenine, and thymine to adenine. So the messenger RNA is going to carry this sequence. So you can see how it isn't exactly what was on the DNA, it's what base would have paired with the DNA. So it's kind of like a code you've got to sit here and figure out. You've got to decode what the messenger RNA says. So the messenger RNA has the pairs that would have gone with the DNA, and so in comes your transfer RNA, which is going to have its amino acids and the anticodon that's necessary for each of these. So each set of 3 is a codon, and it gets transferred over. And so now the transfer RNA is going to come in, and it's going to bring what we need. So it's going to say, okay, we had cytosine, so now we need the guanine. I guess we should really point this way. And then it's going to bring cytosine back to pair with the guanine, thymine back to pair with adenine, cytosine back to pair with guanine, thymine to pair with adenine, and thymine to pair with adenine. So now in a different part of the cell, you've got these codons, and they're going to code for a certain protein. And this is what happens in the cell. So this part would be your translation. So you've got strands of DNA. Part of the cell says, oh, I need a certain protein. Well, this codon codes for one of the proteins you need, and this codon codes for one of the other proteins you need. So the DNA is going to send it. The messenger RNA is going to hold the transcription, which is where it's changed to what the pairs would be. What pairs with each base is going to be the transcription that goes on the messenger RNA. And then the messenger RNA travels off into the cell to where the protein is needed. The transfer RNA is going to bring the bases plus amino acids. And then you're going to get these bases plus the new amino acids are going to give you your proteins that these codons were coding for. So you've got your transcription where it's coded onto the messenger RNA, and then you've got translation where it's decoded and the transfer RNA brings in what you need plus amino acids and your proteins are created. So that's kind of a complicated process, but it's what genes do. That's their job. Their job is to send messages throughout the cell so that new proteins can be created. And they are going to carry your hereditary information, and they have the basic instructions necessary to tell your body how to carry out the hereditary processes and keep producing the genes that you keep producing the cells and the proteins that you need and maintaining your cells. So just keep in mind, genes are units of hereditary information, and they carry messages throughout the cell and instruct the cell on how to create the proteins that your body needs.
We can classify cells into two categories, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. So prokaryotic cells are smaller than eukaryotic cells. In addition to being smaller, they lack membrane-bound nucleuses. So they don't have a membrane-bound nucleus. Now, they contain single-stranded circular DNA molecules that free float in, you can probably guess, they free float in cytoplasm, because cytoplasm is kind of the fluid in a cell that all the other organelles in the cell float around in. So the DNA molecules free float in cytoplasm. So some different organelles that are in prokaryotic cells are ribosomes, centrioles, often one or more flagella, and cytoskeleton elements. Then we have eukaryotic cells, and so these are going to be obviously larger than prokaryotic cells. And these contain linear, double-stranded DNA combined with histone and packaged as chromosomes. And then the chromosomes are found inside a nucleus bounded by two membranes. So notice here, the eukaryotic cells do have a membrane-bound nucleus. Now, eukaryotic cells contain a variety of other membrane-bound organelles, such as mitochondria, chloroplast, endoplasmic reticula, Golgi bodies, lysosomes, and vacuoles. Now, eukaryotic ribosomes are larger and more complex than those found in prokaryotes, which is what is another way of saying prokaryotic cells. Now, you may be wondering, where do you find prokaryotic cells and where do you find eukaryotic cells? Well, prokaryotic cells are usually in single-celled organisms, such as bacteria, whereas eukaryotic cells are what you find in more complex organisms. It's what you see the result of on a daily basis, because plants and animals are made up of eukaryotic cells. So that's a look at prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells and the differences between them.
Context. Sometimes when you're reading and you come across a word that you don't know, you can use context clues to make an educated guess as to what the word means. Now, when you're looking at the word you don't know, you don't want to just look right before and after the word. You usually want to look at the sentence before and the sentence after. And sometimes you even have to look at the whole paragraph to get an idea of what that unfamiliar word means. Now, there are some clues that we can look at to help determine what the word means. One thing you can look at is a description. Sometimes a sentence or a sentence following or before the unfamiliar word will give you a description. For instance, the green-feathered macaw. Well, you may not know the word macaw, but by seeing green feathered, you can infer that it is some kind of a bird with green feathers. Another clue you can look at are synonyms. If you hear the soft and supple leather, well, since you have soft here and then supple, both describing leather, you can figure out that supple probably has something to do with being soft. And in reality, it means moldable. It's easily moldable, and it is somewhat soft to be able to do that. We'll go ahead and note that this one was our bird. Now another clue you can look for are antonyms. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have a malevolent bone in her body. Well, you may not know what malevolent means, but you probably know what sweet means. And if she isn't malevolent and she is sweet, then you can figure out malevolent is something bad, something negative, the opposite of sweet. And in reality, malevolent means evil. Another clue you can look for are definitions. Sometimes the sentence before, after, or part of the same sentence your word is in will just give you the definition of the word. For instance, the echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then they might tell you some interesting fact about the echidna. Well, in commas, right after echidna is the definition of an echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia. So you know what it is right there. The last clue you can look for is tone. Is the rest of this paragraph positive, negative, happy, scared? If you have a paragraph that's all one tone, then the word probably has something to do with that. If it's a scary tone, then this may be a word that it has to do with something scary. If it's positive, it may be a happy kind of word. So you can always take that into consideration whenever you are taking your educated guess. So once you've looked at clues and you've tried to figure out, looking before and after the sentence your word is in, looking at the whole paragraph, seeing if you can find a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or figure out the tone surrounding that unfamiliar word, you want to take a guess as to what the word means. And then you want to reread the sentence to see if it makes sense to you and ask yourself, does it make sense? So if we were to insert bird here, the green feathered bird, well, if it's something that has feathers and we have bird after it, that makes sense, so that one would work. The soft and supple leather. So if we know it means something else soft, maybe moldable, we could say the soft and moldable leather, the soft and flexible leather. Any kind of word like that that you put in that was similar to soft would work. It would make sense in your sentence. Okay, we were thinking evil here, something the opposite of sweet. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone in her body. That makes sense. She is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone. Now, the echidna sentence is a little different. If they plug in a definition for you, then it's a little harder to check. You would just say an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then maybe tell the sentence after that point because the definition's already there for you. There's not really a synonym for echidna or anything else you could have come up with for what that one meant. And once you've checked to make sure they all make sense, then you have a pretty good idea of what that word means. And you can see how using these context clues of looking for a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or the tone of a paragraph can help you figure out that pesky, unfamiliar word. Figurative language. Figurative language is language that goes beyond the literal meaning of a word, and authors will use figurative language to enhance their writing. Some common examples of figurative language are hyperbole, simile, metaphor, and personification. So we'll discuss each of those and I'll give you some examples for each. Hyperbole is exaggeration. People will say something and you aren't meant to take it literally. You're meant to know it's an exaggeration, but it's there just to emphasize how strongly the author is trying to convey something. For instance, I've told you 1,000,000 times. I bet some of you have probably heard that one. And 1,000,000 times, really? probably you haven't heard whatever your parent or teacher has said they've told you a million times. It's an exaggeration. It's hyperbole. It's meant to emphasize that they've already told you this a lot more times before now. Another example would be, I had a ton of homework. You did not literally go home with 2,000 pounds of homework, but you're telling people, I had a lot of homework. It was way more than the normal amount. It was a ton. It was that much homework. So that's what hyperbole is, exaggeration. Next we've got simile, which is comparing two things using like or as. And this is very important. You have to use those words like or as, or it's not going to be a simile anymore. So, the child howled like a coyote. We see our word like. You're comparing two things in this sentence. The child howled like a coyote compares the child to a coyote using the word like. This example is letting you know that the child is loud. Its crying sounds like a howl, much like a coyote. So this figurative language is used to bring a coyote to mind to help you picture and hear in your mind how this child is screaming or crying. Next, let's look at this example. She ran as fast as lightning. Well, that's going to compare two things here, and we see the word as. So what is being compared in this sentence? She ran as fast as lightning. And usually when you have one as, you've got two. So it's comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. And that is being done by using the word as. So when you're comparing a girl to lightning, you're saying she's that fast. It went so fast you barely got to see her before she got past you or got to the finish line. So it's just letting you know she's really, really fast. So that's what simile is, comparing two things using like or as. And again, these are the important words to look for to make it actually be a simile. It could be a metaphor, which compares two things without using like or as. And that is really the big difference between a simile and a metaphor. A simile uses like or as. A metaphor does not use like or as. So let's look at some metaphor examples. She was lightning running down the track. So this sentence is very similar to this one. They're both comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. They're both saying this girl is really fast, but this one just says she was lightning. She was lightning running down the track. It doesn't say she ran as fast as lightning. It doesn't use like or as, it just says she was lightning. So it's a different way to use the same kind of figurative language. So that's one example of a metaphor. Let's look at this. And this is an excerpt from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. Now this one's a little trickier because it doesn't just come out and say, this was this, or this is this. Like here it said she was lightning. But it says that his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. So we're comparing his eyes to a demon's eyes, which is basically comparing him, or a man, to a demon. If his eyes are like a demon's eyes, then this man is being compared to a demon, which is to maybe say that the man is evil. It doesn't mean he's literally a demon. It means he's got some characteristic of a demon. He's maybe an evil person. So in poetry, Your figurative language may not always pop out at you if it's a metaphor. A simile is pretty easy to spot because you'll see like or as. But a metaphor might be a little trickier. So just look for what two things are being compared in that sentence or that phrase of a poem. And the last piece of figurative language we're going to discuss is personification, which is when an inanimate object is given human qualities. You are personifying it. You are making it do something a person would do, even though it's not something that can do these things. And remember, inanimate objects are going to be things that are not alive. A chair, a teapot, the wind, water, those are inanimate objects. So the example here, the water slapped the side of the boat. The water slapped. Can water actually slap like a person would slap? No, but it makes you think of the action of slapping and the sound you might hear with the slap whenever you picture this water slapping the side of the boat. And that's why they're using this particular word and personifying the water. Depending on what the story is about where this sentence appears, it could be that the water is being made as like an evil character. If someone drowns in this story, then the water would be seen as an enemy, and so it slapping the side of the boat would give it that negative feeling. Another example, the teapot shrieked. Shrieking, screaming, that loud sound, you can hear it in your head when you think about the noise a teapot makes. But a teapot isn't actually shrieking like a person would. It's simply making that noise because the air is hot enough that it's trying to get out now. Or the wind howled. Wind can't howl like a wolf would howl, but wind makes that same kind of sound sometimes, and so the author is trying to put that sound of howling in your mind when they're describing the wind. So figurative language can be a lot of different things. Hyperbole, where you're exaggerating. Simile, where you're comparing two things using like or as. Very important markers for a simile. Metaphor, where you're comparing two things without using like or as. And personification, when an object is given human qualities, whenever it's personified. And all of these techniques are used so that the words will go beyond the literal meaning of them and give you a deeper understanding of the poem or the work that you're reading. The author is trying to go beyond the words and make you really think about their meaning and put certain connotations in your head whenever you're reading. Theme. Theme is the overall idea of a piece of literature. So think about the lesson or moral of the story that the author is trying to get across to you. One thing to remember is do not confuse theme with plot. Plot is what the characters do. It's the action of the story. It does not have to do with the overall lesson or message that the author is getting across. Now, obviously, what the characters do is going to help you understand the theme, but plot and theme are not the same thing. Plot is going to be more about human nature, society, and life in general. There can also be more than one theme. The author may have one overall message, but there may be a few messages in there, or you may be able to find more than one theme besides the main controlling theme of the story. Some questions to ask yourself are, what is the lesson or message? And some common themes are, man struggles against society, man struggles against nature, overcoming adversity, the importance of family and friendship, man struggles with faith, sacrifices bring rewards, and honesty is the best policy. So for all of these, I want us to look at the story of the tortoise and the hare from Aesop's Fables. And this shows you that there can definitely be more than one theme for one story. Now, all of these may not be what Aesop had in mind when he was coming up with this fable, but I was able to see all of these themes in the story. The last one, I couldn't come up with something for, but I've got a good one for that as well. So, man struggles against society. You've got this tortoise who feels like he's going to keep going and he's going to try to win the race, but all of society is against him and saying, oh, that hare has got you beat. He's way faster than you. I don't know why you think you're fast enough to beat him. So I'm sure that tortoise was struggling against society's views of him. Another one would be man's struggle against nature. The tortoise is struggling against the nature of his self, how he's made. He's obviously not going to be as fast as the hare. He's going to have to go up hills. He's going to be fighting against the very nature of his self, where the hare is made to go much faster. Overcoming adversity. Just simply winning the race, the tortoise ended up winning even though no one expected him to do it. Even though people were probably telling him, oh, you can't do that. The hare's always going to beat you. The importance of family and friendship. Now, I've talked a lot about society, telling the tortoise he couldn't do this, but I'd like to think that the tortoise had some family and friends on his side that were urging him on, that helped him feel like he could actually go through and win this race. Man struggles with faith. The tortoise had to have faith in himself. The hare was very, very cocky. He felt like he had this race won, so much so that he went and took a nap, where the tortoise didn't do that. He had faith in himself and knew that he could do this if he just kept going, if he gave it his all. And then sacrifices bring rewards. The tortoise sacrificed that nap that the hare took, and in the end he won the race because he just kept going. Now, the moral of the story they give you is slow and steady wins the race, but I can see all of these themes in that story. Now, honesty is the best policy. I couldn't really come up with one for, but you can always look at Pinocchio. Pinocchio, every time he told a lie, his nose grew. It was not a good thing. Every time he lied, something bad happened to him. I won't ruin the whole story for you, but everyone knows about the growing nose, which is a sad punishment for someone who is not using honesty. So it's showing you honesty is the best policy. So whenever you're reading a story, you can look at what the characters are doing to figure out what the plot is, but remember the theme is different. The theme is going to be the controlling idea in that piece of literature. And you want to ask yourself, what is the lesson or moral the author is trying to get across to me?
Characters are an essential part of every story. So characters can be classified into two main categories, flat and round. The terms flat and round pertain to how much the character changes throughout the story. So flat characters have little change in personality throughout the story, or many times no change in personality. They're very predictable, they're always the same. And because they're predictable, they can be considered not very interesting. So that's why they play small roles in the story. The main characters of a story are never going to be flat characters. Instead, they're going to be round characters, because round characters incur lots of change throughout the course of a story. So they play the main roles. So flat characters and round characters both contribute a lot to a story. Obviously, round characters are needed to play the main roles because they're going to be developing and changing a lot, and that's what moves the plot along. The plot is moved along by changes in characters' personalities. Flat characters are also needed, however, because they play the smaller roles in the story, the supporting roles that make the main characters very interesting. So when we're talking about round characters, you probably heard me use the word development. And that's what authors try to do with round characters. They try to develop the characters, and it's the development of the characters that moves the plot along. If the characters stay the same, throughout the entire story, then the plot's not very interesting because the plot's not going to progress very much. So round characters are essential to moving the plot along. But the important thing to take away from this, if you remember one thing, is that characters can be split up into flat characters and round characters. Flat characters having the same personality and round characters changing in personality throughout the story.
In this video, we want to go over prefixes. Prefixes are short little sections of words that come before the root of a word and help you understand what the word means. They add an extra nuance to the word, and why prefixes and suffixes, for that matter, are important. Prefixes coming before the root of the word, suffixes, short little endings after the word, is that if you know your basic prefixes and suffixes, they help you determine the meaning of a word. And they're important clues, especially if you're taking a standardized test where they say we want you to find the word with the opposite meaning. Sometimes just knowing the prefix can give you enough of a clue, even if you don't know what the root means, to find the opposite. We've got a few examples on the board, and we want to go through those briefly just to show you the importance of prefixes, how they can help you in your test-taking strategies, and how they can help you understand the meanings of words. So prefixes give clues as to a word's meaning. Knowing them can help you find the word with the opposite meaning on a test. So words like prefixes like pre. Here we think pre-operative, pre-op. That means before the operation. Or prescient. Pre meaning before, and scient from the word science, which means knowledge. So to know ahead of time. So prescient is to know ahead of time. Pre-game show, the part that comes before the game. So pre means before. The opposite of pre is post. Post-operative care, the care that happens after the operation. Post-game show, the show that happens after the game. So pre is before, post is after. If you realize this opposites, then if you see a word that's got a pre prefix on it, then you look for a word with a post prefix on it if the test is asking you to find the opposite. Another thing would be pro and d. So pro means for, as in pro-life. Someone who is pro-life is for life. De is the negation, so deconstruction. To deconstruct is the opposite of, or the negation of construction. Construction to build up, deconstruct to destroy. So pro meaning for, de is usually a negation, pre before, post after. Knowing your prefixes can be critical, especially if you're not sure of the whole word. You can say, well, let me break this word up into its prefix, its root, and its suffix, and see if I can't decode just from that minimal information the proper answer on the other side. Now, obviously, when you're taking a test, if you know the right answer, you always go with the right answer. But if you're struggling, if you're not sure, this is a strategy you can use. You can look at the word, break it down, and say, here's the prefix, and I know it means this, and I'm being asked to find the opposite. What's the opposite of this prefix? Then I've got my answer more than likely. Caution though, caution. Con and pro are opposites, but congress is not the opposite of progress, although some people might disagree. That's more of a joke in terms of Congress being the opposite of progress, but con and pro are opposites, but you have to know and be careful sometimes. Anyway, that's been just a basic introduction and overview of the importance of prefixes as a test-taking strategy of knowing what they mean to help you determine the meaning of a word, and also to assist you if you're being asked to look for the opposite. If you know what the prefix means and you know what the opposite of that prefix is, it makes it a snap to find the right answer. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information. While you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
Fractions. A fraction is a number that is expressed as one integer written above another integer with a dividing line between them, like x divided by y. So for example, 3/4. In this fraction, 3/4, the top number is called the numerator, and the bottom number is called the denominator. The numerator is the part that's being considered, while the denominator is the whole. So in this fraction, 3/4, we could take a pie shape and cut it into 4 pieces. That's our whole. And the part that's being considered is 3/4. So 1, 2, 3. So now you can see how much of our pie we're talking about, 3/4. We can manipulate fractions, and we do this by multiplying or dividing both the numerator and the denominator by the same number, not by adding and subtracting. We manipulate fractions to do many things. One thing is to compare them. If we were to compare 3/4 and 2/3, we would first need to find what's called a common denominator. Because in order to compare them, I need them to have the same denominator. So I can tell which one's bigger or if they're equal. So we'll take 3/4 and 2/3, and we're going to find a common denominator. When you do that, you want to look for multiples of the denominators. And the least common multiple will be the least common denominator. So the multiples of 4 and 3, 4 is 4, 8, 12, 16, etc. 3 is 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, etc. So the least common multiple between 4 and 3 is 12. So that means I want to change this fraction to something over 12. Same with my other fraction. What I'm doing is creating an equivalent fraction. 3/4 is equal to something over 12. So I'm going to multiply my numerator and my denominator both by 3 to achieve that denominator of 12. So 3 times 3 is 9. And so our fraction is 9/12. And then for 2/3, we'll do a similar thing. We want to change our denominator from 3 to 12. So we multiply 3 times 4 to get 12. And we must do the same to our numerator. 2 times 4 is 8. So now we can easily see which fraction is larger. 3/4 is equivalent to or equal to 9/12. And 2/3 is equal to 8/12. Well, 9 out of 12 is definitely more than 8 out of 12. So we could say that this fraction 3/4 is bigger than this fraction 2/3 if we were to compare them. So let's talk a little bit more about equivalent fractions. All of these fractions are equivalent fractions because they all represent the same value. 2/10, 3/15, 4/20, 5/25. And we could see that they represent the same value more easily by simplifying our fractions. So we said we can manipulate fractions by multiplying the numerator and denominator by the same value, or we can manipulate them by dividing the numerator and denominator by the same value. So if we wanted to simplify this fraction 2/10, we would just divide the numerator and the denominator by the same value. Both 2 and 10 are divisible by 2. So we divide our numerator by 2 and our denominator by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. We do the same thing to our next fraction. 3 and 15 are both divisible by 3. So we divide our numerator by 3 and our denominator by 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. 15 divided by 3 is 5. 4/20. Our numerator and denominator are both divisible by 4. So divide by 4, divide by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. And 20 divided by 4 is 5. Finally, 5/25. Numerator and denominator are both divisible by 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1. And 25 divided by 5 is 5. So as you can see, all 4 of these fractions are equal to 1/5. 1/5 is the simplest form of these fractions, and they are all equivalent fractions since they all have the same value, 1/5. multiples. You can think of multiples as like counting by that number. So for instance, the multiples of 2 would be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc. The multiples of 3 would be 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, etc. The multiples of 4 would be 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and so on. Sometimes you're asked to find the LCM of 2 or more numbers. The LCM is the least common multiple. Least meaning the smallest, common meaning the same, and multiple. So if we wanted to find the LCM of, let's say, 2 and 3, the least common multiple of 2 and 3, so the smallest number that 2 and 3 have in common, would be 6. So that's the LCM of 2 and 3. The LCM of, say, 3 and 4, the very smallest number that they have in common would be 12. And you can find the least common multiple of bigger numbers, like, say, the least common multiple of 12 and 15. So 12 would be 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72, etc. While 15 would be 15, 30, 45, 60. So if we were finding the LCM of 12 and 15, the smallest number they have in common is 60. So the least common multiple is 60. Ratios. A ratio is a comparison between two quantities. You can think of a ratio like a fraction. And since it's just like a fraction, a comparison of two numbers, it is treated a lot like a fraction, meaning you're going to simplify it anytime you can. Let's look at this problem. Suppose a sampling of fish from a local pond contains 12 bass, 8 catfish, 38 minnows, and 4 trout. What is the ratio, so the comparison of two numbers, of bass to minnows? Now, when they ask you this question, they're telling you exactly how to set your ratio up. Since it says bass to minnows, we read left to right. We also read from top to bottom. Since a ratio is a fraction, then they're telling you what your numerator should be and what your denominator should be. So our ratio is going to be bass to minnows. And now we can substitute how many bass and minnows we have. According to our problem, we have 12 bass and we have 38 minnows. So that ratio would be 12 to 38. But again, since this is a fraction, we're going to simplify it if we can. And 12 and 38 do have a GCF of 2, so we're going to divide 12 by 2 to get 6, and we'll divide 38 by 2 to get 19. Therefore, our ratio of bass to minnows is 6 to 19. But that's not the only way we can write a ratio. We could also write it as 6 to 19, or as 6 to 19. And these all mean the same thing, and they all give you the same information, that for every 6 bass in the pond, there are 19 minnows in your pond. It is important, though, the order of your numbers. Since the ratio they were asking for was bass to minnows, your bass number should be first, and then your minnows number. So make sure you put it in the right order. That is very important.
in math, we have rational numbers and we have irrational numbers. So we're going to be taking a look at rational numbers, which have 4 different categories, and those are integers, percents, fractions, and decimals. So we're going to define each of these. Even if you're already somewhat familiar with them, we're going to go ahead and define them and give some examples. So starting out with integers. Integer is a positive or negative whole number or 0. So 9 would be a whole number. It would be an integer because it's a positive whole number. Negative 6 is an integer because it's a negative whole number. Then of course 0 is an integer because we said it was. And so now we move on to percents, which is kind of a more complicated way to say percent is a part per 100. So an example of a percent is 20%, which we could also write as 20 parts per 100. But the important thing here is just you know what a percent is, like 20%. Then fractions, which is a proportion. So an example would be 20 divided by 10 or 2 divided by 4. And of course we have decimals, so this is where we have an integer, maybe 1, maybe 89, maybe 0. And then we have a decimal place, and then we have numbers after the decimal, like 20.53. So we have our integer, we have a decimal, and then we have numbers after the decimal. So integers, percents, fractions, and decimals are all rational numbers, usually. There are some rules. So in order to be a rational number, just summarize, it either has to be an integer, like we talked about. If it's a number like 9, negative 6, 0, it's always going to be a rational number. It gets more complicated when we come to fractions and decimals. If it's a fraction, it has to be an integer divided by an integer. And this integer cannot equal 0. So it's an integer divided by an integer. So 7 divided by 4 cuts it. That works. Now, decimals are a little bit more complicated because it either has to be a terminating decimal or a repeating decimal. So an example of a terminating decimal would be something like 2 divided by 4. From that you get 0.5. It ends right there at the 5. For a repeating decimal, you do 1 divided by 3 and you get 0.3333. It goes on forever. But notice we're getting the same number every time. So really you could erase all of these 3's and just put a line over the 3 showing it's a repeating decimal. What you don't want is a decimal like pi, where you have 3.1415926. 5359. It just keeps going on and on. So there's no ending to it, so it's not a terminating decimal, and there's no pattern to it, so it's not a repeating decimal. That's what an irrational number is, one that just keeps going like this. These numbers, they have basically a stopping point. And so that's what we're looking for. And so the reason I say that a fraction has to be an integer over an integer is because when you divide an integer by an integer, you get a clean number. You get a decimal that's repeating or terminating. When you start dividing a decimal or a fraction by a number or a fraction by another fraction, that's when you're going to start getting messy. So really, if you're wondering whether a fraction is a rational number, what you can do is go ahead and divide it out and then look at the decimal and decide whether it's terminating, repeating, or non-ending. And that's how you can determine if it was a rational number.
Decimals. Decimals use place value to represent an amount. To read a decimal, like we have here, first read the number to the left as a whole number, followed by and, then read the number to the right of the decimal, followed by the last place value. So this number would be read as 641 and 5,129 10,000ths. This number could also be represented as a mixed number. 641 and 5,129 10,000ths. Let's look at another decimal. 5 and 8,139 10,000ths. We could write this number as an improper fraction by taking the 5 plus, this would be 8/10ths since it's in the tenths place, plus 1/100ths plus 3,000ths plus 9/10,000ths, which would give us 58,139 10,000ths. So we've seen a decimal in decimal form. We've seen it represented as a mixed number and also as an improper fraction.